Hello and welcome to my presentation, Challenges and Opportunities in the Portuguese Energy Transition, the Evidence So Far. I'm Katherine Mahoney and my co-authors are Dr. João Pedro Gouveia and Dr. Rita Lopes. I'd just like to introduce the energy transition here and then to talk a bit about the situation in Europe and then more specifically in Portugal. So the 2015 Paris Agreement saw signatories agree to cut greenhouse gas emissions to 2 degrees below pre-industrial levels. The EU has positioned itself at the forefront of international efforts to fight climate change, and to date the EU has had some success in these efforts, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 23% compared to 1990 levels. However, over the years there's been a struggle to secure competitively priced and environmentally responsible energy. And it's become increasingly evident that reaching this goal through a fossil fuel-based energy system is a bit of a contradiction. But there's also been increasing recognition that as a right, European citizens should have access to secure, sustainable and affordable energy. And really this can only be done by a reform of the energy system. So in response to these challenges, the EU has released a series of policies, including the Clean Energy for All package, the European Green Deal and the Renovation Wave. And these packages broadly agree that there is a need to decarbonise the energy supply, to renovate buildings and to improve domestic energy efficiency. Thinking about inequality and energy poverty, the Energy Union package in 2015 found several structural inefficiencies, fragmentation of policy, market stagnation, and the inability to afford adequate energy services or the condition of energy poverty to be quite prevalent. And at present it's estimated that energy poverty affects approximately 50 million Europeans. And the EU has committed to tackling energy poverty and to protecting vulnerable consumers. So the chart there on the left shows the at-risk of poverty rate plotted against the energy poverty index. And on the right, equivalent incomes in the European countries, with the lighter areas showing lower incomes. And we can see that some of the countries there with an elevated risk of both energy poverty and general poverty are also some of the lower income countries, for example, Lithuania, Cyprus and Portugal. Here I'd like to take a look at how the energy transition has affected energy poverty and inequality. So in the previous slide, we saw that many countries that tended to be lower income also had a higher risk of energy poverty. And these countries have been labelled the energy poverty periphery by Busorowski et al. And in the chart there, it shows progress in alleviating domestic energy poverty. And the darker areas show worse progress. And these countries show several common traits, including low incomes, high energy costs, low climatization equipment ownership, and poor building quality. However, an analysis of the share of energy from renewables in member states shows that although some of the leading countries, such as Sweden or Finland, are wealthier countries, some of these countries are also made up of the energy periphery countries, such as Latvia or Estonia. So there's not a clear trend there of lower income countries being behind in the energy transition. These countries also show a higher rate of excess winter deaths, oddly enough, particularly in countries with higher, milder winter temperatures such as Cyprus, Malta, Portugal and Spain. I'd like to look here at the opportunities and challenges that the energy transition presents. So the transition presents employment opportunities. Reductions in greenhouse gases have broader societal benefits, including health and ecosystem services. There will be greater energy autonomy and less dependence on national resources or national resource limits, and a reduction of the energy island effect, where countries are limited by poor infrastructure. Lower energy costs, more efficient homes, and less dependence on volatile fossil fuel pricing. Some of the challenges are that energy prices can increase or decrease depending on the scale of renewable plants. There's a risk that the monopolization of the energy system by a small number of companies will continue. There's a risk of low carbon gentrification, so the displacement of people from their homes once they have been fitted with energy efficiency upgrades. And high upfront costs of technology tend to be less accessible to the most vulnerable. So looking specifically at energy poverty in the Portuguese case, the 2019 Energy Poverty Vulnerability Index by Gouveia et al. Shows energy poverty in the winter there on the left, on the red map, and in the summer on the blue map. And in both cases, the darker areas show greater vulnerability. And in both cases, that greater vulnerability is in the north and inland regions. And this applies also to the energy performance gap, which refers to the energy necessary for homes to reach a level of thermal comfort recommended by regulatory bodies. Approximately 22% of the population are in energy poverty regarding space heating and 29% with regard to space cooling. Approximately 70% of properties are EPC grade C or below, and the current mitigation measure is a financial aid towards gas and electricity bills. However, that's a national strategy. There's a high rate of excess winter deaths, an increased incidence of hospital admittance in summer months for mental health conditions. Portugal also has the highest number of children in Europe with an increased risk of developing a health condition because of living in a poor quality building. Portugal has made impressive progress in the implementation of the energy transition, defined as a leader in integrating wind and solar PV by the International Energy Agency. This is despite weak engagement with the Kyoto Protocol, and despite being one of the least resilient countries to the impacts of the 2008 recession. An evaluation there shown in the graph of the share of electricity from renewables in 2018 puts Portugal fourth in that ranking. With the renewables uptake has created jobs, and the number of jobs in this sector is expected to triple by 2030. There's a high level of concern about climate change in the country, but there's also a high level of concern about future energy price increases. And in 2019, equivalized gas and electricity prices in both cases were the fourth highest in Europe and Portugal. So opportunities and challenges in the Portuguese case. So Portugal's plans for decarbonisation are ambitious, aiming, for example, to source 90% of electricity from renewables by 2050. And the National Energy and Climate Plan has also recognised the need to tackle energy poverty and to characterise it at different scales. And there are also targets for increasing the uptake of renewables and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the issue of poor quality buildings has been tackled in the long-term strategy for the renovation of buildings. There are, however, some gaps in these policies, including a potential 11-fold increase in the need for domestic space heating and a potential 24-fold increase in energy needs for domestic space cooling. And there are also other issues surrounding the costs of new technology, the rate of uptake, and potentially opposing interests. So looking in a little more depth at these gaps, so thinking about CO2, we know that climatization equipment ownership rates are low and there is a reluctant use of this equipment, but the neutrality roadmap requires 50% reduction in the energy used for domestic heating. In terms of renovation, there are questions about how accessible the mechanism of residents claiming back the costs of work retrospectively is to vulnerable consumers. And then in the terms of the uptake of new technologies, again, the costs of these seem to be beyond the reach of particular groups. And then the energy companies have a critical role in the energy transition, yet the transition hinges on the reduction of energy consumption, which is a bit of a conflicting interest. So overall, it's unclear how vulnerable consumers will be benefiting from the transition. So exploring the reduced role of vulnerable consumers a little bit, we conducted a stakeholder analysis to show who had the most interest and power in the Portuguese energy transition, thinking about energy poverty in particular. And we found that the majority of stakeholders were international businesses, either energy companies or in some way involved in the renovation process. And an evaluation of these groups in terms of whether they were core, direct or indirect found that approximately 80% of the core group were businesses, and only 13.9 vulnerable consumers or community groups. And so to conclude here, the energy transition overall in Europe provides a range of opportunities and challenges, thinking specifically about energy poverty. And although there are significant employment opportunities, it's not clear that the broader benefits of the transition are at present filtering down to the consumer level. Portugal specifically has made impressive progress with regard to decarbonising the energy supply. But energy prices remain high, and there are many consumers still in energy poverty. And as the transition gets further underway, there are risks that existing vulnerabilities will continue, because there are conflicting interests, a lack of financial resources on the part of the consumer, and governments and vulnerable groups have a reduced role compared to private companies. And these risks need to be evaluated and reflected as the transition goes forward to mitigate this effect, and to ensure that the goals of equality and fairness in the transition are met. So just to say thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.